You're nothing but a gold-digging parasite who trapped my son with pregnancy, and I'll make sure everyone in this family knows what trash he married." Those words sliced through the air like shrapnel, delivered with the precision of someone who'd been sharpening them for months. My name is Natasha, and the woman who spoke them was supposed to be family. Instead, Constance Hartwell, my mother-in-law, had just declared war in her pristine kitchen in Willowbrook Springs, Colorado, while her decorated Army Ranger son was deployed halfway across the world, believing his mother and wife were getting along just fine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. From wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been systematically destroyed by someone who smiled at your wedding photos? Someone who hugged you in public but spent every private moment trying to convince your spouse that you were the worst mistake they'd ever made? Well, let me tell you what happens when that person pushes too far and a battle-hardened soldier comes home to discover the truth. It was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday afternoon. My husband Jackson had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months, and I was 7 months pregnant with our first child. Constance had insisted I come to her house every weekend to keep the family close while Jackson's away. What she really meant was to keep me under surveillance, to catalog every mistake, every awkward moment, every reason why I wasn't good enough for her perfect son. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there from the beginning. When Jackson first introduced me to his family 2 years ago, Constance's smile never quite reached her eyes. She'd ask seemingly innocent questions. "Oh, Natasha works at the animal shelter? How? Charitable. Does that pay well?" Or, "Community college, how practical. Not everyone needs a real education, I suppose." Each comment was wrapped in silk but lined with thorns. Jackson never saw it. How could he? Constance transformed the moment he walked into a room, becoming the doting mother who just wanted the best for her son. She'd gush about how happy she was that he'd found someone, how she was looking forward to grandchildren, how she couldn't wait to welcome me into the family. The performance was flawless. But that Sunday, something had changed. Maybe it was because Jackson's deployment had been extended another 3 months. Maybe it was because I was showing more, making the pregnancy impossible to ignore. Or maybe she'd just grown tired of pretending. Whatever it was, the mask slipped completely. I'd arrived at her house at 2 p.m., as I had every Sunday for the past 6 months. The Hartwell estate sat on 12 acres of manicured Colorado landscape, a testament to 3 generations of military success and strategic investments. Jackson's grandfather had been a decorated Marine, his father a Navy admiral, and Jackson himself had followed the family tradition, becoming one of the Army's elite Rangers before his promotion to staff sergeant. The house itself was a monument to service, walls lined with commendations, photographs of ceremonies, flag cases containing the colors from various deployments. Everything about it screamed honor, duty, and respect. Everything except the woman who lived there. "Sit down, Natasha," Constance had said when I arrived, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "We need to have a conversation." I settled into the leather armchair across from her, my hands instinctively moving to rest on my growing belly. Something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, reminded me of Jackson when he was preparing for a difficult mission. Focused, determined, dangerous. "I've been thinking a lot while Jackson's been away," she began, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "About his future, about what's best for him, about mistakes that need to be corrected before they become permanent." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the aspen trees that lined her property, but inside, everything had gone still. "I know what you did," she continued, her voice steady and cold. "I know you got pregnant on purpose. Jackson told me he wanted to wait until after his next promotion, until he was more established. But somehow, miraculously, you managed to change his mind. Or rather, you made the decision for him." My mouth went dry. "Constance, that's not—" "Don't." She held up a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm talking now. You see, I've done my research on you, Natasha Pierce. Your family's financial troubles, your father's drinking problem, your mother's 3 marriages. You saw my son as a meal ticket, a way out of that trailer park life in Riverside County." Each word hit like a physical blow. She had indeed done her research, twisting every private detail Jackson had shared with her into ammunition. My father's struggle with alcoholism after losing his job at the factory. My mother's difficult relationships after my father left. Our family's financial struggles that had forced me to work 3 jobs while attending community college. You think I don't see what you're doing? Constance stood now, pacing behind her chair like a prosecutor addressing a jury. The sweet act, the, "Oh, I'm just so grateful to be part of this family," routine, "But I know exactly what you are." That's when she delivered the line that would change everything, the line that would echo in my mind for months, the line that would eventually reach my husband's ears and trigger a reckoning none of us saw coming. "You're nothing but a gold-digging parasite who trapped my son with pregnancy, and I'll make sure everyone in this family knows what trash he married." The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, 7 months pregnant, in the home of the woman who was supposed to become my child's grandmother, processing the fact that she'd just called me a parasite, that she'd reduced my marriage to a transaction and my pregnancy to a trap. But what Constance didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known, was that her perfectly planned attack was about to backfire in ways she never imagined. Because while she'd been busy researching my family's problems, she'd forgotten to consider her son's unwavering sense of justice. The same sense of justice that had made him an exceptional soldier. The same protective instinct that had earned him commendations for defending his fellow Rangers under fire. And she definitely didn't know that Jackson had been planning a surprise return home for our baby shower, scheduled for the following weekend, or that he'd been in contact with base communications, checking in on me regularly through video calls I'd thought were routine check-ins. Most importantly, she had no idea that respect, the very thing she was demanding from me, was about to be redefined by a man who'd spent his entire adult life learning that true respect is earned through character, not demanded through intimidation. The war Constance Hartwell declared that Sunday afternoon was about to become a battle she was completely unprepared to fight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me tell you who I really am, because Constance's version of my story was about as accurate as a broken compass in a lightning storm. My name is Natasha Pierce Hartwell, and yes, I did grow up in Riverside County in a single-wide trailer that had seen better decades. But what Constance conveniently left out of her character assassination was that I graduated valedictorian from Riverside Community College with a 4.0 GPA while working 3 jobs. That I earned a full scholarship to Colorado State University for veterinary studies. That I met her son not at some bar or through some desperate scheme, but at a volunteer event where I was providing free veterinary care for military families, pets. You see, I'd been working at the Mountain View Animal Rescue Center in Fort Collins for 2 years when the base reached out to us. They needed someone to help with a veterinary clinic day for deployed soldiers, families, wives and children who were struggling to afford pet care while their spouses were overseas. I volunteered every weekend for 6 months before I ever laid eyes on Jackson Hartwell. The first time I saw him, he wasn't even supposed to be there. He was on leave, visiting his buddy Marcus. Yeah, I know, coincidence. Whose wife Sarah had brought their German Shepherd in for hip x-rays. Jackson was just along for the ride, still in his civilian clothes, helping carry the 90-pound dog because Sarah was 8 months pregnant and couldn't lift him. I remember thinking 2 things. First, that he had the gentlest hands I'd ever seen on a man that size when he was calming down the nervous dog. And second, that he asked more questions about animal care than most veterinary students I knew. Not because he was trying to impress me. He had no idea I was even paying attention, but because he genuinely cared about making sure his friend's family was taken care of while the husband was deployed. We didn't even speak that day, not really, Just a thank you when I handed him the aftercare instructions for the dog's arthritis medication. But something about the way he looked me in the eye when he said it, like he really meant it, like he saw me as a person worth thanking properly, that stuck with me. It was 3 weeks later when he came back, alone this time. Said he'd been thinking about maybe getting a dog himself, something to help him transition when he got back from deployments. PTSD wasn't something soldiers talked about openly back then, but I'd worked with enough military families to recognize the signs. The way he held his shoulders, the way his eyes never quite stopped scanning the room, the way he seemed more comfortable talking to the animals than to people. We spent 2 hours that Saturday afternoon walking through the kennels, not because he was hitting on me. Jackson Hartwell was about as smooth as sandpaper when it came to talking to women, as I'd learn later, but because he was genuinely trying to find the right match. He asked about temperaments, exercise needs, training requirements. He wanted to know about the dogs, backgrounds, their traumas, what they needed to feel safe. When we got to Rex, a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois mix who'd been returned twice for being, quote, too intense, Jackson stopped walking. Rex had been found abandoned near the base, probably a washout from the military working dog program. He was smart, loyal, and completely devoted once he trusted you, but he needed someone who understood discipline and consistency. This one, Jackson said quietly, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the dog. That's how our relationship started, not with some elaborate scheme or desperate plot to trap a soldier. With a damaged dog who needed someone who understood that healing takes time, patience, and the kind of quiet strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Jackson adopted Rex that day and started coming by every weekend for training tips, except the training sessions turned into coffee afterward. Coffee turned into long walks with Rex through the mountain trails. Walks turned into dinners, where Jackson would tell me about growing up in a military family, about the pressure to live up to 3 generations of heroes, about feeling like he was always being measured against impossible standards. I told him about my own family, the real story, not Constance's twisted version. About my dad, who'd worked at the Riverside manufacturing plant for 15 years before the company moved operations to Mexico. How he'd started drinking when he couldn't find work that paid enough to support us. How my mom had tried to hold everything together, working double shifts at the diner, but eventually had to make impossible choices just to keep food on the table. I told him about the nights I'd spent at the kitchen table, doing homework by lamplight because we couldn't afford to heat the whole trailer, dreaming about becoming a veterinarian so I could help animals who couldn't help themselves. About working at the gas station from 5 a.m. to 1 p.m., then classes from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., then cleaning offices until midnight, just to pay for textbooks and tuition. Jackson never looked at me with pity, never made me feel like I should be ashamed of where I came from. Instead, he said something I'll never forget. You know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who fought a war before she was 20 and won it without firing a shot. That's the kind of strength they don't teach in any military academy. 6 months later, he proposed. Not with some elaborate gesture or expensive ring. Jackson had saved up for 3 months to buy a simple solitaire from a local jeweler, and he proposed on the hiking trail where we'd had our first real conversation, with Rex sitting patiently beside us like he knew this moment was important. We planned a small wedding, just family and close friends. Jackson was nervous about me meeting his mother. He'd warned me that she was particular about things, that she had high standards. He made it sound like she was just protective, maybe a little old-fashioned. He never used words like controlling or manipulative. Those weren't in his vocabulary when it came to family. The first time I met Constance was at a dinner she'd arranged at the country club in Willowbrook Springs. I'd driven down from Fort Collins wearing the nicest dress I owned, a simple black sheath I'd bought for my college graduation. Nothing fancy, but appropriate. Or so I thought. Constance took one look at me and I could see her cataloging everything. The dress that was clearly off the rack, the shoes that were comfortable but not expensive, the small purse that held exactly what I needed and nothing more. But she smiled and hugged me and told Jackson how lovely I was, how happy she was to meet the woman who'd captured her son's heart. It was only later, when Jackson went to the bathroom, that she leaned in close and whispered, "Just so we understand each other, dear, Jackson comes from a very specific kind of family. We have certain expectations. I do hope you'll be able to rise to the occasion." Even then, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Thought maybe she was just nervous about her son getting married, maybe protective in the way mothers can be. I had no idea I was looking at a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of psychological warfare, who could smile while sliding a knife between your ribs so smoothly you wouldn't feel it until you tried to breathe. But that Sunday afternoon in her pristine kitchen, with her calling me a parasite while I sat there 7 months pregnant with her grandchild, I finally understood exactly who Constance Hartwell really was. And more importantly, I was about to find out exactly who her son was when the people he loved were threatened. The thing about Sunday dinners at the Hartwell estate was that they were supposed to be sacred. Jackson had told me stories about growing up with these weekly gatherings, how his grandfather would carve the roast while regaling everyone with tales from his Marine deployments, how his father would quiz Jackson about current events and military strategy, how Constance would fuss over everyone's plates and make sure the crystal glasses never went empty. It's the one tradition that kept our family grounded through every deployment, every transfer, every challenge, Jackson had explained during one of our evening walks with Rex. No matter where we were stationed, no matter what was happening in the world, Sunday dinner was non-negotiable. It's when we reconnected, when we remembered what we were fighting for. When Jackson deployed to Afghanistan, Constance had insisted that I continue the tradition. "We can't let the family fabric unravel just because one thread is temporarily elsewhere," she'd said, with that warm smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Besides, you'll need the support system. Military wives have been depending on each other for generations." At first I was touched. Here was my mother-in-law, reaching out during what she knew would be a difficult time, offering to include me in something that clearly meant everything to the Hartwell family. Jackson was thrilled when I told him about her invitation during our first video call after his deployment. "That's exactly what I was hoping would happen," he'd said, his pixelated face breaking into the first genuine smile I'd seen since he'd left. "Mom can be a little intense sometimes, but when she takes you under her wing, you're family for life. This is her way of showing you that you belong." So every Sunday at 2 p.m. sharp, I would drive the 45 minutes from our small apartment in Fort Collins down to Willowbrook Springs, winding through the Colorado foothills until I reached the imposing gates of the Hartwell estate. The house sat at the end of a tree-lined drive, all stone and timber and soaring windows that caught the afternoon light like some architectural magazine spread. The first few Sundays were actually pleasant. Constance would greet me at the door with a hug that felt almost maternal, taking my coat and leading me into the great room where she'd prepared tea service on the antique silver set that had belonged to Jackson's great-grandmother. We'd sit by the massive stone fireplace, surrounded by decades of family photographs and military memorabilia. And she'd ask about my pregnancy, my work at the animal rescue, how I was handling Jackson's absence. "You know, dear," she'd said during that second visit, settling into her favorite wingback chair with her perfectly coordinated china cup, "I was so young when I married Jackson's father. Admiral Hartwell was stationed at Pearl Harbor, and I was just a Navy nurse who thought she knew everything about military life. How wrong I was." She'd regaled me with stories about the challenges of military marriages, the loneliness during deployments, the pressure of maintaining a household that could pack up and move at a moment's notice. It felt like mentorship, like she was preparing me for the realities of being a Hartwell wife. "The key," she'd explained, her voice taking on that instructional tone that reminded me of Jackson when he was teaching Rex a new command, "is understanding that you're not just married to a man. You're married to a legacy. Every decision you make reflects on 3 generations of service. Every choice affects not just your immediate family, but the reputation we've spent decades building." At the time, I'd nodded along, grateful for the guidance. Military life was still new to me. And I wanted desperately to do right by Jackson and his family. When she suggested I might want to elevate my presentation for formal military events, I took it as helpful advice. When she recommended I read certain books about military protocol and history, I added them to my reading list immediately. "It's not that there's anything wrong with how you carry yourself, sweetheart," she'd said during my 4th visit, her tone gentle but pointed. "It's just that Jackson will be up for promotions soon, and these things matter more than people realize. The wives are always being watched, always being evaluated. We have to be above reproach." She'd even offered to take me shopping for appropriate attire for upcoming military functions. I know the right shops, the right designers. Nothing too expensive, of course, but quality pieces that will serve you well throughout Jackson's career. Consider it my investment in your future. I'd accepted gratefully, not recognizing the subtle undermining happening with every suggestion. The implication that my current wardrobe wasn't suitable. The gentle correction of my table manners. The way she'd rephrase things I said to make them sound more refined. During our 5th Sunday together, she'd introduced me to her social circle. 3 other military wives, all impeccably dressed, all perfectly coiffed, all married to high-ranking officers. They'd descended on the Hartwell dining room like a well-coordinated military operation themselves, armed with casserole dishes and cutting observations. "Oh, Constance, she's absolutely precious," Mrs. Blackstone had said, looking me up and down like I was a new recruit. "So fresh, so unpolished. You have quite the project ahead of you." "Now, Dorothy, don't be cruel." Constance had laughed, but her eyes had sparkled with something that made my stomach tighten. "Natasha just needs some guidance. Not everyone has the advantage of growing up in military society." They'd spent the afternoon discussing various wives who had successfully transitioned into military life and others who had struggled with the adjustment. Every story was a cautionary tale. Every example a subtle warning about the consequences of not measuring up to their standards. "Poor Lieutenant Morrison's wife," Mrs. Caldwell had sighed, shaking her perfectly styled head. "She tried so hard, but she just never quite fit. He had to choose between his career and his marriage. Such a shame." "These things have a way of working themselves out," Constance had added meaningfully. "The military has a way of separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak." By my 6th visit, I was starting to feel like I was being prepped for an exam I didn't understand. Constance had begun correcting my grammar mid-sentence, suggesting I might want to work on my diction for formal events. She'd started timing my responses to her questions, encouraging me to think before speaking so I wouldn't embarrass myself in important company. "It's just that Jackson's career is at such a crucial point," she'd explained, her voice dripping with concern. "One wrong impression at the wrong time could affect his entire trajectory. I know you wouldn't want to be responsible for holding him back." The pressure was subtle but constant. Every compliment came with a correction. Every gesture of inclusion contained a reminder of how much I still had to learn. She had a way of making me feel simultaneously welcomed and warned, embraced and evaluated. By my 7th visit, I was arriving at the estate with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with morning sickness. I'd started rehearsing conversations in my car, practicing responses to the kinds of questions she might ask, second-guessing every outfit choice and every word that came out of my mouth. But Jackson was so happy during our video calls. He'd light up when I mentioned my Sunday visits with his mother, asking detailed questions about what we'd discussed, what she'd taught me, how she was helping me prepare for military life. His joy was infectious, and I found myself emphasizing the positive aspects of our time together, while downplaying the increasing anxiety I felt every time I walked through those imposing front doors. "Mom says you're fitting in beautifully," he'd told me during our 8th-week check-in. "She mentioned you've been asking great questions about protocol, and that you're really taking her guidance to heart. That means everything to me, Tash. I was worried about leaving you during your first pregnancy, but knowing you have her support makes all the difference." How could I tell him that his mother's support was starting to feel more like psychological boot camp? How could I explain that every Sunday felt like a performance evaluation, where I was perpetually falling short of standards I didn't fully understand? So I smiled and nodded and continued making the drive to Willowbrook Springs every week, telling myself that this was just part of becoming a military wife, that Constance's intensity came from a place of love and concern for her son's future. I had no idea that what I was experiencing wasn't mentorship at all, it was reconnaissance. Constance had been systematically cataloging my weaknesses, identifying my insecurities, mapping out exactly where to strike when she decided the time was right to remove me from her son's life permanently. And that 8th Sunday, with Jackson's deployment extended and my pregnancy becoming more visible every day, she finally felt confident enough in her intelligence gathering to launch her first full-scale attack. That 8th Sunday started differently from the moment I pulled through the estate gates. Usually, Constance would be waiting at the front door with her practiced smile and outstretched arms, ready to usher me into the warm sanctuary of family tradition. This time, I had to ring the doorbell twice before she answered, and when she finally did, her expression was cold enough to freeze the Colorado River. "Natasha," she said, stepping aside to let me enter but offering none of her usual pleasantries. No comment about my dress. No inquiry about the baby. No gentle hand on my arm guiding me toward the great room. Just my name, spoken like she was identifying a suspect in a lineup. The house felt different too. The warmth I'd grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows seemed harsher somehow, casting sharp shadows across the Persian rugs and highlighting the stern faces in the military portraits that lined the hallway. "We need to have a conversation," she said, her voice carrying that command authority that must have been genetic in this family. "Kitchen. Now." The kitchen was Constance's domain, all granite countertops and professional-grade appliances that gleamed like weapons in an armory. She'd always served our tea in the formal dining room or the great room, spaces designed for gracious entertaining. The kitchen was where she worked, where she controlled every element of her domestic empire. Taking me there instead of the usual gathering places felt intentional, strategic. She gestured toward one of the high-backed stools at the center island, positioning herself across from me like we were about to negotiate a prisoner exchange. I lowered myself carefully onto the seat, my 7-month belly making the maneuver awkward and vulnerable. She remained standing, claiming the high ground both literally and figuratively. "I've been doing some thinking during Jackson's extended deployment," she began, her hands placed flat on the granite surface like she was grounding herself for what was coming. "About his future, about what's best for him, about mistakes that need to be corrected before they become permanent." The word, mistakes, hit me like a slap. After 8 weeks of Sunday dinners, 8 weeks of guidance and inclusion and what I'd thought was growing acceptance, I was being reclassified as a mistake. Something to be corrected. "I'm not sure I understand," I said, though part of me was already beginning to. The signs had been there. The increasingly critical observations, the subtle undermining, the way she'd been documenting my every perceived flaw like she was building a case file. "Oh, I think you understand perfectly," she replied, beginning to pace behind the island like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "You're an intelligent girl, Natasha. Intelligent enough to recognize an opportunity when you saw one. Intelligent enough to execute a plan." My mouth went dry. "What plan?" "The pregnancy plan." She stopped pacing and fixed me with a stare that could have cut steel. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" "Jackson tells me everything, sweetheart." Including the fact that he wanted to wait until after his next promotion to start a family. Until he was more financially stable, more established in his career. But somehow, miraculously, you managed to change his mind. That's not what happened. Isn't it? She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what looked like screenshots of text messages. Let me refresh your memory. March 15th. Jackson texts me. "Mom, Tash, and I talked about waiting a few more years before kids. Want to make sure I can provide the kind of life they deserve. March 22nd, he texts me, "Tash is pregnant. Can't believe we're going to be parents. That's quite a dramatic shift in 7 days, don't you think?" I felt the room spinning slightly. She had been monitoring their text conversations, cataloging dates, building a timeline that supported her narrative. Never mind that Jackson and I had decided together after a long weekend of talking about our future, about how life in the military meant you couldn't always wait for perfect timing. Never mind that the pregnancy had been a surprise to both of us, but a welcome one that we'd embraced together. "Jackson was excited about the baby," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course he was excited," she snapped. "He's an honorable man." When faced with an unplanned pregnancy, he did what his upbringing taught him to do. He stepped up. He married you. He's providing for you. But that doesn't mean the pregnancy wasn't strategically timed on your part. She began circling the island now, closing the distance between us like a predator stalking wounded prey. "You see, I've done my research on you, Natasha Pierce. Extensively. Your family's financial situation is even worse than you've let on, isn't it? Your father's drinking led to more than just job loss. There are legal issues, debts, a pattern of poor decisions that's left your entire family on the brink of ruin." Each word was a precision strike, aimed at vulnerabilities she'd been mapping for weeks. My father's DUI arrest last year. The medical bills from my mother's breast cancer scare that had drained their savings. The fact that I'd been sending them money every month since graduating college. Money I'd never mentioned to Jackson, because I didn't want him to think I came with financial baggage. "You needed a way out," she continued, her voice gaining momentum like an avalanche. "You needed security, stability, someone to rescue not just you but your entire dysfunctional family. And my son, with his military salary and family connections, must have looked like the perfect solution." "That's not true," I said, but the words came out weak and defensive. How could I explain that I'd never asked Jackson for money for my family? That I'd been supporting them with my own earnings from the animal rescue? That I'd actually tried to discourage him from proposing so quickly because I was worried people would think exactly what his mother was thinking? Isn't it? She stopped directly across from me, leaning forward on her palms. "Tell me, how long after you started dating did you conveniently stop taking birth control? How many times did you forget to mention that you were in your fertile window? How carefully did you time those romantic weekend getaways?" The accusations were getting more specific, more vicious, more personal. She was painting a picture of calculated seduction that bore no resemblance to the relationship Jackson and I had built. We'd been careful. We'd used protection. The pregnancy had genuinely been unexpected, a birth control failure that we'd discovered together when I'd been late and decided to take a test just to be sure. "You have no idea what you're talking about," I said, finding some strength in my voice finally. "Jackson and I love each other. We built something real together, something that has nothing to do with money or security or any of the things you're suggesting." "Love," she laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "How convenient. And I suppose it's just coincidence that you fell in love with a man whose family has money, connections, and a reputation that could open doors for someone from your background?" She was really hitting her stride now, years of resentment and control issues pouring out in a torrent of accusations. This wasn't just about protecting her son. This was about maintaining her position as the most important woman in Jackson's life, about ensuring that no one could threaten the influence she'd wielded over him for 30 years. "You want to know what I really think?" she said, straightening to her full height and looking down at me like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "I think you researched my family before you ever met Jackson. I think you volunteered at that military event specifically to meet someone like him. I think every conversation, every shared interest, every moment of connection was carefully orchestrated to make him believe he'd found his soulmate." That's when she delivered the killing blow, the line that would echo in my mind for months afterward, the words that would eventually change everything about how this family operated. You're nothing but a gold-digging parasite who trapped my son with pregnancy, and I'll make sure everyone in this family knows what trash he married." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the house seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls themselves were shocked by the venom that had just been unleashed. I sat there, 7 months pregnant with her grandchild, processing the fact that the woman who had welcomed me into her home, who had guided me through military protocol, who had seemed to embrace me as a daughter, had just called me a parasite. But it wasn't over. The attack was just getting started. "You think I haven't been watching you these past 8 weeks," she continued, her voice dropping to something almost conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Every question you've asked, every reaction you've had, every little tell that gives away exactly who you really are? I've been documenting everything, Natasha, building a case." She pulled out a leather portfolio from the kitchen drawer and opened it on the counter between us. Inside were printed screenshots, handwritten notes, even photographs. A comprehensive dossier that she'd been compiling like she was preparing for psychological warfare. "Every time you've chosen the wrong fork at dinner, every time you've mispronounced a word or misunderstood a reference, every moment where your true breeding has shown through the act you've been putting on, it's all here." My hands moved instinctively to protect my belly as I stared at the evidence of her systematic surveillance. She hadn't been mentoring me at all. She'd been studying me, looking for weaknesses, gathering ammunition for this exact moment. "And when Jackson comes home," she said, closing the portfolio with a snap, "he's going to see exactly what kind of woman he's tied himself to. Because I'm going to make sure he does." What Constance didn't know as she stood there in her pristine kitchen, wielding her leather portfolio like a weapon of mass destruction, was that her perfectly crafted attack was about to backfire in ways she never could have imagined. Because while she'd been busy playing psychological warfare games with a pregnant woman, she'd completely miscalculated who she was actually dealing with. You see, there were quite a few things about me that hadn't made it into her surveillance file. Details that Jackson had never shared because they weren't his stories to tell. Information that might have changed her entire strategy if she'd bothered to dig deeper than surface-level assumptions about trailer park girls and their supposed limitations. First, she had no idea that my community college education had included a full academic scholarship that I'd turned down to Colorado State University's pre-veterinary program. Not because I couldn't handle a 4-year institution, but because my father's accident had left our family in crisis, and I'd chosen to stay close to home to help keep everything together. The community college path hadn't been my only option. It had been my sacrifice. Second, she didn't know that I'd graduated with a double major in animal science and business administration, maintaining that 4.0 GPA while working 3 jobs, and managing my family's finances after my father's injury. The business classes hadn't been random electives. They'd been strategic preparation for a future I'd been planning since I was 16 years old. Third, and most importantly, she had no clue that the job at the animal rescue she'd been so dismissive of was actually a carefully calculated stepping stone. While she'd been busy cataloging my perceived inadequacies, I'd been building something that would have impressed even her social circle of military wives, if they'd been capable of recognizing ambition that didn't come wrapped in old money and family connections. The Mountain View Animal Rescue Center wasn't just where I worked, it was where I'd been developing a revolutionary approach to animal therapy for military veterans dealing with PTSD. What had started as volunteer work had evolved into a comprehensive program that paired rescue animals with returning soldiers, creating healing relationships that benefited both species. During my first year at the center, I'd noticed patterns that the established veterinary community had missed. Certain types of rescued animals, particularly those who'd experienced trauma themselves, seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to connect with veterans struggling with similar psychological wounds. Dogs who'd been abandoned showed remarkable patience with soldiers who had trust issues. Cats who'd survived abuse became therapy companions for veterans dealing with hypervigilance and anxiety. I'd started documenting these connections, building case studies, reaching out to military mental health professionals who were desperately searching for alternative treatment methods. Traditional therapy wasn't working for everyone, and the VA was struggling to find effective interventions for the growing number of veterans returning from Afghanistan and Iraq with invisible wounds. By the time I met Jackson, I'd already submitted my first research proposal to the Department of Veterans Affairs. By the time we got married, I'd received preliminary approval for a pilot program that would pair my animal therapy protocols with existing VA mental health services. And by the time Constance was calling me a parasite in her kitchen, I was 3 weeks away from receiving official notification that my program had been selected for a $2.3 million federal grant. But there was more, much more. The business administration degree hadn't been theoretical. I'd been using those skills to transform the Animal Rescue Center from a struggling nonprofit that could barely keep its doors open into a model facility that other organizations were beginning to study and replicate. When I'd started there, they were operating on a shoestring budget, constantly on the verge of closing due to lack of funding. 3 years later, we had a waiting list of facilities wanting to implement our protocols. I developed a sustainable business model that combined traditional animal rescue with therapeutic services, educational programs, and research initiatives. Corporate sponsors were lining up to support our work. Military installations across the country were requesting presentations about our programs. Veterinary schools were adding our protocols to their curricula. The day before Constance's kitchen attack, I'd received a call from Dr. Patricia Hensley, the director of the Rocky Mountain Veterinary College. She'd been tracking my work for over a year, watching the success rates of our veteran-animal pairing program, reviewing the research data I'd been collecting. The call was an invitation. They wanted me to head up their new Department of Animal-Assisted Therapy, a position that would come with a full professorship, a research budget, and the opportunity to expand my programs nationwide. Miss Pierce, Dr. Hensley had said, her voice warm with respect, "What you've accomplished without traditional academic credentials is frankly unprecedented. We've had Harvard graduates apply for this position, but none of them have your combination of practical experience, innovative thinking, and proven results. We want you to consider leading this department and taking your work to the national level." The salary they were offering was more than Jackson made as a staff sergeant. The research opportunities they were proposing would put me in contact with leading trauma specialists, military psychologists, and policymakers at the highest levels of government. The position would make me one of the youngest department heads in the college's history and give me a platform to influence veteran care across the entire United States. I'd asked for a week to consider the offer, wanting to discuss it with Jackson during our next video call. The timing couldn't have been better. His deployment was scheduled to end in 6 weeks, just enough time for me to transition into the new role before the baby arrived. But Constance knew none of this. While she'd been busy compiling evidence of my supposed inadequacies, documenting my mispronunciations and wrong fork choices, I'd been building a career that would soon put me in rooms with people who could influence military policy at the Pentagon level. While she'd been treating me like an uneducated interloper, I'd been developing programs that were already being implemented on military bases across the Southwest. The irony was staggering. She'd spent 8 weeks trying to prove I wasn't good enough for her son, while I'd been quietly accomplishing things that would make me a valuable asset to any military family. Her precious social circle of officers' wives, with their charity luncheons and protocol obsessions, couldn't have imagined the kind of impact I was already having on the military community. And there was one more thing she didn't know, something that would have changed everything about her strategy if she'd been smart enough to uncover it. Something that would turn her systematic campaign to destroy my marriage into the biggest miscalculation of her life. Jackson hadn't just been calling to check in during his deployment, he'd been conducting his own research. You see, my husband might have been raised by a master manipulator, but he'd also been trained by the Army to gather intelligence, to verify information, to question assumptions that could get his team killed. And some instinct, maybe the same one that had kept him alive through 2 previous deployments, had been telling him that something wasn't quite right about the glowing reports his mother had been giving him about our Sunday visits. So he'd started asking questions. Specific questions. About what we discussed, about what I was working on, about how I was handling the challenges of military life, and my answers hadn't been matching up with what Constance was telling him. Where she'd described a struggling young woman who needed constant guidance, he was hearing about research breakthroughs and professional opportunities. Where she'd portrayed someone overwhelmed by military protocol, he was seeing evidence of someone who was thriving in military circles. Where she'd painted a picture of financial desperation, he was learning about grant funding and job offers that would secure our family's future for generations. 3 days before Constance's kitchen ambush, Jackson had made a decision that would change everything. He'd used his command privileges to make a secure international call, not to me, but to Dr. Hensley at the veterinary college. He'd wanted to verify the opportunity I'd mentioned, to understand exactly what kind of work his wife was doing while he was deployed. The conversation had lasted 45 minutes. Dr. Hensley had spent that time explaining to a decorated Army Ranger that his wife was already being recognized as a pioneer in military veteran care, that her work was being studied by researchers at Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic, that she was being courted by universities and government agencies across the country. "Your wife is remarkable, Sergeant Hartwell," Dr. Hensley had told him. "In 3 years, she's revolutionized how we think about trauma recovery. The programs she's developed are saving lives, and the research she's conducting is going to influence veteran care for decades to come. You should be incredibly proud." Jackson had hung up that call with a very different understanding of what was happening at home, and he'd immediately begun making arrangements that would bring him back to Colorado much sooner than anyone expected. But Constance was still completely in the dark about all of this as she stood in her kitchen, gloating over her psychological victory against a woman she'd dramatically underestimated. She thought she was destroying a gold digger. She had no idea she was about to face the full protective fury of an Army Ranger, whose wife and unborn child had just been threatened by someone he'd trusted his entire life. I drove home from that kitchen confrontation in a daze, Constance's words echoing in my head like shrapnel. The 45-minute drive back to Fort Collins felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Every few miles I had to pull over to catch my breath, the baby moving restlessly as if sensing my distress. That night I couldn't bring myself to tell Jackson what had happened during our scheduled video call. How could I explain that his beloved mother had just declared war on our marriage? How could I describe the venom in her voice, the calculated cruelty of her attack, without sounding like I was trying to turn him against his family? Military deployments were hard enough without adding family drama to the mix. So I smiled and nodded and told him about my work at the rescue center, about the baby's latest ultrasound, about anything except the fact that I was now living in fear of what Constance might do when he returned home. Jackson looked tired during that call, older somehow, and I didn't want to add to whatever stress he was already carrying overseas. "You seem different tonight, Tash," he said, studying my face through the pixelated video connection. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," I lied, forcing brightness into my voice. "The baby's been especially active today, and I think I'm hitting that uncomfortable stage of pregnancy where nothing feels quite right." He accepted the explanation, but I could see concern in his eyes. Jackson had always been able to read me better than I could read myself, and even through a grainy international video call, he was picking up signals that something was wrong. What I didn't know was that my emotional state wasn't the only thing Jackson was monitoring from Afghanistan. Unknown to me, he'd been conducting what the military calls back-channel intelligence gathering, verifying information through independent sources rather than relying on single-point reporting. In civilian terms, he'd been fact-checking his mother's glowing reports about our Sunday visits. The first crack in Constance's perfect narrative had appeared 3 weeks earlier, when Jackson had casually mentioned to his buddy Marcus that his mom was helping his wife navigate military social protocols. Marcus had laughed and said something that stopped Jackson cold. "Dude, your wife doesn't need help with military stuff. She's already more connected to veteran services than most officers' wives I know." That comment had planted a seed of curiosity that Jackson couldn't shake. If I was already well connected in military circles, why did his mother's reports make it sound like I was struggling to fit in? If I was developing programs that other military families were talking about, why was Constance describing me as overwhelmed and out of my depth? So Jackson had started making inquiries. Discreet ones, professional ones. The kind of systematic information gathering that had kept his Ranger unit alive through multiple high-risk operations. What he discovered over the next 2 weeks shattered everything he thought he knew about what was happening at home. Far from being the struggling military wife his mother had described, I was actually becoming something of a legend in veteran care circles. The animal therapy program I'd developed wasn't just helping local veterans. It was being studied and replicated across multiple military installations. Jackson learned that Colonel Patricia Martinez, the commanding officer at Fort Carson, had specifically requested information about my protocols for her own base's mental health services. That Dr. James Morrison, the head psychiatrist at the VA Medical Center in Denver, was citing my research and presentations to Department of Defense officials. That Brigadier General Sarah Chen had personally recommended my program to the Army Surgeon General's office. The picture that emerged from Jackson's investigation was completely different from what Constance had been telling him. Instead of a wife who needed constant guidance and support, he was discovering that I was already operating at levels that impressed senior military leadership. Instead of someone struggling to understand military culture, I was someone who was actively improving military culture. But the most damning piece of intelligence came from an unexpected source. Jackson's platoon sergeant, First Sergeant Williams, happened to mention during a routine briefing that his own brother had been through one of my animal therapy programs at the Denver VA. "Your wife saved my brother's life, Hartwell," Williams had said matter-of-factly. "Jake came back from Iraq so messed up we thought we were going to lose him. Couldn't sleep, couldn't be around people, couldn't function. Then he got into that program with the rescue dogs, and it was like watching someone come back from the dead. She's doing important work, that wife of yours." That conversation had prompted Jackson to make the secure international call to Dr. Hensley, the conversation that had revealed the full scope of my professional accomplishments. By the time he hung up that call, Jackson understood that something was very, very wrong with the information he'd been receiving about his family situation. But he still wasn't prepared for what happened next. The second major intelligence breakthrough came from an entirely unexpected direction: the military spouse network that Constance had always claimed to be protecting me from. Jackson reached out to Captain Lisa Rodriguez, whose wife Maria ran the family support group on base. He wanted to understand why I hadn't been participating in traditional military spouse activities, something his mother had attributed to my difficulty fitting in with proper military society. What Maria Rodriguez told him during a 20-minute phone conversation changed everything. "Jackson, I've been trying to get Natasha involved with our group for months," Maria had explained, her confusion evident even through the international connection. "But every time I reach out, she says your mother has advised her to focus on more appropriate activities for her situation. She seems to think we wouldn't welcome her because of her background." "What do you mean, her background?" "I don't know exactly. She mentioned something about your mother explaining that women from her socioeconomic level might not be comfortable with our group dynamics. It broke my heart, honestly. We would have loved to have her involved. What she's doing with veteran therapy programs is exactly the kind of community service we're always trying to support." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Constance hadn't been protecting me from military social circles. She'd been isolating me from them. She'd been systematically cutting me off from the support networks that might have revealed her manipulation, while simultaneously positioning herself as my only source of guidance and approval. Jackson realized that his mother hadn't been mentoring me at all. She'd been conducting a psychological isolation campaign designed to make me completely dependent on her version of reality while keeping me away from anyone who might contradict her narrative. The final piece of the puzzle came when Jackson decided to verify one more element of his mother's reports. She'd been telling him that I was struggling financially during his deployment, that the pregnancy was causing stress about our ability to provide for the baby. According to Constance, I'd been asking subtle questions about the family's financial resources, fishing for information about inheritance and long-term security. But when Jackson checked our joint bank account and credit monitoring services, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Not only was I not struggling financially, but I'd been making regular deposits that I'd never mentioned. Significant deposits. Money that was clearly coming from professional activities I was pursuing independently. Further investigation revealed that these deposits corresponded with consulting fees, speaking engagements, and research stipends related to my veteran therapy work. I wasn't financially dependent on his military salary. I was building my own career and income stream while he was deployed. The woman his mother had described as a gold-digging parasite was actually contributing more to our household income than his own military pay. Jackson sat in his quarters at Bagram Airfield, staring at bank statements and research papers and commendation letters, realizing that everything he'd been told about his wife's situation was not just wrong, it was deliberately fabricated. His mother hadn't been protecting him from a manipulative woman. She'd been protecting herself from losing control over her son's life. And that's when Jackson Hartwell, decorated Army Ranger and devoted son, made a decision that would change the power dynamics in his family forever. He was coming home. Not in 6 weeks as originally planned, but in 6 days. He'd already spoken to his commanding officer about the emergency family situation that had developed, though he hadn't specified the exact nature of the emergency. His CO, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, had been surprisingly supportive. Take care of your family, Hartwell. That's always the priority. What Jackson hadn't told his commanding officer, what he hadn't told anyone, was that the family emergency he was responding to wasn't a crisis that needed his help. It was a crisis that he was going to create when he confronted the person who had been systematically destroying his wife's mental health while he was serving his country overseas. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Willowbrook Springs, Colorado, Constance Hartwell was celebrating what she believed to be a complete victory. She'd successfully traumatized her pregnant daughter-in-law into submission, documented evidence of her social inadequacies, and positioned herself to reveal the quote about my manipulative nature when Jackson returned from deployment. She had no idea that her son was already reviewing the evidence she'd unknowingly provided, evidence that painted a picture of psychological abuse, deliberate isolation, and calculated cruelty toward a pregnant woman whose only crime had been loving her son enough to endure months of torture rather than risk damaging his relationship with his family. The woman who'd spent 30 years controlling every aspect of her son's life was about to discover what happened when an Army Ranger's protective instincts were triggered by a threat to his family. And this time, the threat was coming from inside the house. The first sign that Constance's victory wasn't as complete as she'd imagined came 3 days after her kitchen ambush, when I failed to show up for our regular Sunday dinner. I'd made the decision Tuesday night, sitting in our small apartment in Fort Collins, staring at the framed photo of Jackson and me on our wedding day. I couldn't keep subjecting myself to psychological warfare, not when I was carrying his child, not when every encounter with his mother left me questioning my own worth. So Sunday at 2 p.m., instead of driving to Willowbrook Springs, I took Rex for a long walk through the foothills, breathing in the clean mountain air and trying to remember who I was before Constance Hartwell had spent 8 weeks systematically dismantling my confidence. The phone started ringing around 3:30. "Natasha, sweetheart, where are you?" Constance's voice on my voicemail was sugar-sweet, with just the faintest edge of irritation. "I have dinner prepared and I'm starting to worry. Please call me back as soon as you get this message." I deleted it without responding. The second call came an hour later. This time the sweetness was strained. Natasha, I'm genuinely concerned now. This isn't like you to simply not show up. If you're upset about our conversation last week, we need to discuss it like adults. Family doesn't run away from difficult conversations. Family. The word tasted bitter coming from someone who just finished explaining in elaborate detail why I would never truly be family. By evening, the calls were coming every 30 minutes. Each message revealed a little more desperation, a little more of the control freak beneath the concerned mother-in-law facade. Natasha, this is childish behavior. You can't simply ignore family obligations because your feelings were hurt. Jackson expects us to maintain family unity while he's deployed, and your absence is disrupting that unity. I've been more than patient with your adjustment period, but this kind of sulking is exactly the sort of immature response I was concerned about. We need to address this immediately. If you think you can manipulate this situation by playing the victim, you're mistaken. I have documentation of our conversations, and Jackson will hear about your behavior when he calls next. The threats were escalating, but something interesting was happening with each voicemail. Constance was revealing more about her true motivations, more about the control mechanisms she'd been using, more about exactly how precarious her position actually was. Her mask was slipping, and desperation was making her sloppy. Monday brought a new strategy. Instead of calls, she showed up at the Animal Rescue Center. I was in the middle of a therapy session with Robert Chen, a Marine veteran who'd been working with a rescue dog named Buddy for 3 weeks. Robert had been struggling with severe PTSD after his second deployment to Afghanistan, and this was the first time I'd seen him genuinely smile since starting the program. Buddy, a German Shepherd mix who'd been abandoned by his previous military family, had finally begun trusting Robert enough to sleep beside his chair during our sessions. Miss Natasha, our receptionist Ashley whispered, appearing at the therapy room door with obvious discomfort, there's a woman here who says she's your mother-in-law. She's insisting on speaking with you immediately. Through the glass partition, I could see Constance in the lobby, standing ramrod straight in her expensive coat, surveying the rescue center like she was inspecting troops. Several of our volunteers were staring at her with obvious confusion. She looked like she'd stepped out of a country club board meeting and wandered into the wrong building. Tell her I'm in session and will be for the next 2 hours, I said quietly. If she'd like to schedule an appointment, she can leave her contact information. Ashley nodded and returned to the lobby. I watched through the glass as she delivered my message, then watched Constance's face transform into something I'd never seen before. Pure rage, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough to hide from someone who'd learned to read micro-expressions while working with traumatized animals. Constance didn't leave. Instead, she took a seat in our lobby and waited, for 2 hours. When my session with Robert ended and I walked him to the front desk to schedule his next appointment, she was still there, sitting perfectly straight in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her expensive purse clutched in her lap like a weapon. "Hello, Constance," I said, keeping my voice professional. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Obviously not, or you would have answered your phone," she replied, her voice carrying the kind of command authority that probably worked wonders at charity fundraisers but felt completely out of place in our informal rescue environment. Robert, who'd been signing paperwork at the reception desk, looked up sharply at her tone. Military veterans have finely tuned radar for hostile situations, and Constance had just pinged every warning system he had. "Is there a problem here, Ms. Natasha?" Robert asked, his body language shifting into something I recognized from Jackson's posture when he was assessing potential threats. "No problem at all," I said quickly. "Mrs. Hartwell was just leaving." "Actually, I wasn't," Constance said, standing and fixing Robert with a look that suggested he should mind his own business. "Natasha and I have family matters to discuss and—" "Ma'am," Robert interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd commanded soldiers in combat zones. "I don't know who you are, but I know disrespect when I hear it. Miss Natasha is helping me save my life. and I don't appreciate anyone coming into her workplace and speaking to her like that." The lobby had gone completely silent. Our volunteers, our visitors, even the animals seemed to sense the tension. Constance looked around the room and realized that she'd made a critical, tactical error. She'd entered hostile territory without reconnaissance, and she was badly outnumbered by people who respected me. "This is a private family matter," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. "No, ma'am," said Jennifer Martinez, one of our volunteers whose husband was deployed to Iraq. "This is Ms. Natasha's workplace, and you're disrupting her professional environment. That makes it our business." I watched something fascinating happen in that moment. The community that Constance had convinced me I didn't belong to, the military families she'd suggested wouldn't accept someone from my background, were circling the wagons to protect me. Without knowing any details about our family conflict, they'd instinctively recognized predatory behavior and moved to shut it down. Constance realized she was losing control of the narrative, badly. In front of witnesses who knew me professionally, who respected my work, who would remember this encounter if she tried to spin it later. "Natasha, we will finish this conversation," she said, her voice low and threatening. "You can't avoid family responsibilities forever." "Mrs. Hartwell," I said, finding strength in the support of my colleagues, "if you'd like to discuss family matters, you can schedule an appointment through proper channels. But you will not disrupt my workplace or disrespect the veterans I serve." She left, but not before making one final tactical error. As she reached the door, she turned back and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Your husband will be very interested to learn how his wife behaves when he's serving his country overseas." The implication was clear to everyone in the room. She was threatening to sabotage my marriage, to paint me as the problem in our family dynamic. What she didn't realize was that she'd just made that threat in front of a dozen military family members who understood exactly what kind of psychological warfare she was waging against a pregnant woman whose husband was deployed. Tuesday brought escalation. Constance began calling the rescue center directly, demanding to speak with my supervisor about, quote, "concerns regarding employee behavior." When our director, Dr. Patricia Hensley, took her call, Constance launched into what could only be described as a character assassination campaign. "I'm calling out of concern for one of your employees," Constance had said, according to Dr. Hensley, who later described the conversation to me in detail. "My daughter-in-law has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior, and I'm worried that her emotional instability might be affecting her work with vulnerable veterans." Dr. Hensley, who had been planning to offer me the department head position, listened to Constance's 20-minute monologue about my supposed mental health issues, financial desperation, and manipulative tendencies. Then she asked a single question that derailed Constance's entire strategy. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you aware that your daughter-in-law is being considered for a federal grant to expand her veteran therapy programs nationally?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Dr. Hensley thought the call had been disconnected. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Constance finally managed. "Natasha has developed one of the most innovative approaches to veteran mental health care that I've seen in 30 years of practice. The Department of Veterans Affairs is considering funding her research at levels that would make her one of the most well-funded researchers in the field. I'm curious why you'd be concerned about someone with such impressive professional accomplishments." The call ended abruptly, but the damage to Constance's credibility was done. Dr. Hensley immediately called me to warn me that someone was trying to sabotage my professional reputation, and to assure me that the attempt had only served to highlight how impressive my actual accomplishments were. Wednesday brought the most desperate move yet. Constance somehow obtained the contact information for Jackson's commanding officer and placed a call to Bagram Airfield, claiming there was a family emergency that required Jackson's immediate attention. What she didn't know was that Jackson had already been in contact with his CO about returning home early. What she also didn't know was that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had been briefed about the family situation that required Jackson's attention, though not in the way she expected. "Mrs. Hartwell," Morrison had said, according to Jackson's later account, "your son has already apprised me of the family emergency you're referring to. He'll be addressing it personally when he returns to Colorado this weekend." "This weekend?" Constance had repeated, her voice sharp with surprise. "But Jackson isn't scheduled to return for 6 weeks." "Plans change, ma'am. Your son is a dedicated soldier and a devoted family man. When family situations require his attention, the Army supports him in handling them appropriately." The call ended with Constance finally realizing that her carefully orchestrated campaign was about to face a reckoning she hadn't prepared for. Her son was coming home early, and she had no idea what he'd already learned about her treatment of his wife. Thursday and Friday brought radio silence. No calls, no visits, no attempts at contact. It should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like the calm before a massive storm. Because somewhere in the back of my mind I knew that Jackson was coming home soon, and I knew that Constance was planning something big for his return. What I didn't know was that Jackson had spent the last week conducting the most thorough intelligence operation of his military career, and that he'd already decided exactly how he was going to handle the family emergency his mother had created. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes the Colorado Rockies look like they've been painted against the sky. I was in the nursery we'd been slowly putting together, folding tiny clothes and trying to imagine what our life would look like when Jackson returned, when I heard Rex barking in the living room. Not his usual alert bark, but the deep, protective sound he made when he sensed something important happening. I walked to the front window and felt my heart stop. There was Jackson, standing on our front porch in his ACUs, his duffel bag at his feet, looking like he'd stepped straight out of my dreams and into reality. 6 weeks early. Without any warning. Just home. For a moment, I couldn't move. After months of video calls and delayed messages and the constant ache of missing him, he was actually here. Real. Solid. Present. But something in his posture, something in the set of his shoulders, told me this wasn't the surprise homecoming I'd been fantasizing about. I opened the door and Rex immediately positioned himself between Jackson and me, which was odd since Rex had always adored Jackson. But animals sense things humans miss, and Rex was picking up on an energy that had nothing to do with homecoming joy and everything to do with mission preparation. "Hey," Jackson said simply, and the single word carried more weight than any of our hour-long deployment phone calls. "You're home," I whispered, still not quite believing it. "I'm home," he confirmed, but he didn't move to embrace me. Instead, he studied my face with the kind of systematic attention he usually reserved for threat assessment. "We need to talk, Tash. About everything." I knew immediately that he knew. Not just pieces of it, not just hints, but everything. The careful neutrality in his voice, the way he was holding his body, the fact that he'd come home without warning anyone. This was Jackson in full operational mode, and I was either an asset to be protected or a situation to be managed. "How much do you know?" I asked. "Enough to understand that my mother has been conducting psychological warfare against my pregnant wife while I've been deployed overseas," he said, his voice deadly calm. "The question is, why didn't you tell me?" The hurt in that question nearly broke me. Not accusation, not anger, just raw pain that I'd suffered alone rather than trusting him with the truth. I sank onto the couch, suddenly feeling the full weight of the isolation Constance had imposed on me. "Because she's your mother," I said simply. "Because you love her, and she loves you, and I didn't want to be the reason you had to choose between us. Because military deployments are hard enough without adding family drama that might get you killed, because you were distracted." Jackson closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, I saw something I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but a cold, calculated fury that made me understand why enemy combatants feared Army Rangers. Tash, what she did to you wasn't family drama. It was abuse. Systematic, calculated, deliberate abuse of a pregnant woman whose only crime was loving her son. And the fact that you protected me from knowing about it while you suffered through it alone." He stopped, his jaw working like he was physically restraining himself from saying something he'd regret. He sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I want you to tell me everything. Every conversation, every incident, every moment where she made you feel like you weren't good enough. I've already gathered intelligence from other sources, but I need to hear it from you." So I told him everything. The weeks of subtle undermining disguised as mentorship. The gradual isolation from military spouse networks. The systematic documentation of my perceived inadequacies. The final kitchen confrontation where she'd called me a parasite and threatened to destroy our marriage. Jackson listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, processing what I'd told him with the same methodical approach he used for mission planning. "Show me your phone," he said finally. I handed it over, watching as he scrolled through weeks of missed calls and increasingly desperate voicemails from Constance. He listened to several of them, his face becoming harder with each message. "She's been escalating since you stopped responding," he observed. "Classic predator behavior when the victim removes themselves from the abuse cycle. The desperation indicates loss of control." The clinical way he analyzed his mother's behavior was almost more disturbing than the behavior itself. This wasn't a son struggling to understand why his mother had turned cruel. This was a soldier cataloging enemy tactics and planning an appropriate response. "Jackson, what are you going to do?" He looked at me with the kind of focus that had earned him commendations for leadership under fire. "I'm going to establish boundaries that protect my family. Permanently." "She's still your mother." "No," he said, his voice cutting through any ambiguity. "A mother protects her son's family. A mother supports her son's choices. A mother doesn't psychologically torture her pregnant daughter-in-law. What she is someone who happened to give birth to me, and who has spent 30 years believing that gave her ownership rights over my life." He pulled out his phone and began typing with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been planning this message for days. "What are you writing?" "A formal notification of new family protocols," he said without looking up. Clear, unambiguous, with no room for interpretation or negotiation. He showed me the message before sending it. "Mother, I have returned from deployment and conducted a full assessment of the family situation that developed during my absence. Your treatment of my wife was unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Effective immediately. 1. All contact with Natasha must be approved by me in advance. 2. All family gatherings must be scheduled through me with 48-hour notice. 3. Any attempt to undermine my marriage or manipulate family relationships will result in permanent cessation of contact. 4. You will issue a formal apology to Natasha within 72 hours, acknowledging your behavior and committing to changed conduct. These are non-negotiable terms. Your response will determine the future of our relationship. Staff Sergeant Jackson Hartwell." "Jackson, that's very formal." "It's a military communication to someone who has declared hostilities against my unit," he said matter-of-factly. "She chose to engage in psychological warfare. Now she gets to deal with someone who actually knows how to wage war." He sent the message and immediately turned his phone to silent. "She'll respond within minutes." Probably multiple times. We're not engaging with emotional manipulation or attempts to negotiate. The terms are set. Sure enough, his phone started lighting up with incoming calls and messages almost immediately. Jackson glanced at it once, then set it aside completely. "Aren't you going to answer?" "Negative. In military operations, you establish your position and hold it. You don't get drawn into reactive engagement with hostile forces." The way he talked about his mother as a hostile force should have been heartbreaking, but instead it felt like relief. For months, I'd been fighting a war. One didn't understand against an enemy I couldn't identify because I kept thinking of her as family. Jackson had returned from actual war with the clarity to see the situation for what it really was. What happens now? Now we establish our defensive perimeter and see how she responds to the new operational reality, he said, moving to sit beside me on the couch for the first time since he'd arrived. But whatever happens, you need to understand something, Tash. You are my primary responsibility. You and our baby are my mission. Everything else, including my relationship with the woman who gave birth to me, is secondary to that mission. He pulled me against him, and for the first time in months, I felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally protected by someone who understood that love wasn't about keeping peace at any cost. It was about standing guard against anyone who threatened the people you'd sworn to protect. I should have trusted you with this from the beginning, I said. You were trying to protect me. That's what good soldiers do for their unit, he said, his voice softer now. But you're not fighting alone anymore, and she's about to discover what happens when someone threatens an Army Ranger's family. His phone buzzed with another incoming call. Jackson looked at the screen, saw his mother's name, and turned the phone completely off. Boundaries aren't suggestions, Tash. They're fortifications. And fortifications are only effective if you never let anyone breach them, no matter who they are or what they claim they deserve. The external validation that would ultimately expose the full scope of Constance's miscalculations began with a phone call that came Monday morning, just 48 hours after Jackson's ultimatum. I was making breakfast while Jackson reviewed the 17 voicemails and 32 text messages his mother had left over the weekend, all of which he'd cataloged but not answered, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Pierce Hartwell? This is Jennifer Walsh from the Colorado Springs Gazette. I'm calling about a story we're running this week about innovative veteran support programs in the region. Your animal therapy initiative was recommended to us by several sources at Fort Carson, and we'd love to feature your work. I looked at Jackson, who raised an eyebrow and gestured for me to put the call on speaker. We'd been so focused on the family crisis that I'd forgotten about the wider professional world that had been building around my work while Constance was busy trying to tear down my personal life. I'm flattered by the interest, I said carefully, but I'm not sure this is the right time for media attention. Actually, Ms. Pierce Hartwell, the timing couldn't be better. We've learned that your program is being considered for expansion to multiple military installations, and there's talk of federal funding that could make this a national model. The story is going to run regardless. We'd just prefer to include your perspective rather than writing it without your input. Jackson was already pulling out his laptop, typing rapidly. Within minutes, he'd found the reporter's credentials, verified her identity, and pulled up preliminary information about the story she was referencing. His military intelligence training was coming in handy for civilian life in ways neither of us had expected. She's legitimate, he said quietly. And she's right about the federal funding. It's bigger than you told me, Tash. The conversation with Jennifer Walsh lasted 45 minutes. She'd done extensive research, interviewing Dr. Hensley, several veterans who'd been through my program, and officials from the Department of Veterans Affairs who were tracking our success rates. What emerged from her questions was a picture of professional achievement that I hadn't fully grasped myself. Ms. Pierce Hartwell, are you aware that your program has a 92% success rate in reducing PTSD symptoms among participants? That's unheard of in traditional therapy approaches. The VA is calling your model revolutionary. Jackson was taking notes throughout the conversation, his expression shifting from surprise to something that looked like awe. When I hung up, he closed his laptop and stared at me with the kind of intensity usually reserved for mission briefings. Tash, why didn't you tell me how significant this had become? Because I was too busy being convinced by your mother that none of it mattered, I said, the truth hitting me as I spoke it. She spent months making me feel like my work was a hobby, like I was playing at being important, while the real adults handled serious matters. I started seeing my own accomplishments through her eyes. That afternoon, Jackson made a decision that would change everything about how our family story played out in the public eye. He called Colonel Patricia Martinez at Fort Carson, the commanding officer who'd been following my work. "Colonel Martinez, this is Staff Sergeant Jackson Hartwell. I believe you know my wife, Natasha Pierce Hartwell." The conversation that followed was enlightening in ways that Jackson later described as, quote, "professionally humbling." Colonel Martinez spent 20 minutes explaining to a decorated Army Ranger that his wife was already being discussed at Pentagon-level meetings about veteran care innovation. "Sergeant Hartwell, your wife has accomplished something remarkable. She's created a therapeutic model that's being studied by military psychologists across all branches of service. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have received briefings about her work. We're looking at implementing her protocols at installations nationwide." When Jackson hung up that call, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I knew you were amazing, Tash. I didn't know you were changing military mental health care across the entire United States." The external validation was accelerating in ways that made Constance's timing particularly catastrophic. Tuesday brought a call from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C. "Ms. Pierce Hartwell, I'm calling with official notification that your grant application has been approved. The Department of Veterans Affairs is prepared to fund your animal therapy program with $2.8 million over 3 years, with the expectation of expanding to 50 military installations if initial results continue to match your pilot program success rates." Jackson, who was listening on speakerphone, nearly dropped his coffee cup. $2.8 million in federal funding wasn't just professional recognition. It was the kind of career-defining achievement that most researchers spent decades trying to achieve. Additionally, Dr. Morrison continued, "We'd like to invite you to present your findings at the National Conference on Military Mental Health in December. Your keynote presentation would be attended by senior leadership from all military branches, VA administrators, and mental health professionals from across the country." A keynote presentation at a national conference to an audience that included generals, admirals, and policymakers who shaped veteran care for the entire United States military. Wednesday brought the article in the Colorado Springs Gazette, and it was even more comprehensive than I'd expected. The headline read, "Local Woman's Revolutionary Program Transforms Military Mental Health Care." The story detailed my background, the development of the animal therapy program, the federal funding, and included quotes from veterans whose lives had been changed by the work. What made the article particularly powerful was the context it provided. Jennifer Walsh had done her homework, explaining how traditional PTSD treatments had been failing significant numbers of veterans, how suicide rates among military personnel remained alarmingly high, and how my approach was offering hope where other methods had reached their limits. Pierce Hartwell's program represents a paradigm shift in how we think about trauma recovery. Dr. Hensley was quoted as saying, "She's not just helping individual veterans. She's changing the entire field of military mental health care." Jackson posted the article on his social media with a simple caption, "Proud husband of an American hero." Within hours, it had been shared by hundreds of his military contacts, including several officers who outranked him significantly. Thursday brought the most significant external validation yet, a call from General Sarah Chen's office at the Pentagon. General Chen, a 2-star general who oversaw military family services, wanted to schedule a personal meeting to discuss implementing my program across all Army installations. Ms. Pierce Hartwell, her aide explained, "General Chen has been following your work for several months. She believes your approach could be instrumental in addressing the mental health crisis affecting military families nationwide. She'd like to discuss how the Army can support expanding your program on a scale that could impact thousands of service members and their families." A personal meeting with a 2-star general about my work to discuss national implementation of programs I developed in a small animal rescue center in Fort Collins. Jackson was on the phone with his commanding officer within minutes, requesting permission to accompany me to the Pentagon meeting. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Hartwell, your wife is doing work that could save more military lives than most combat operations. Of course, you have permission to accompany her. In fact, I'm recommending that the Army provide full support for her presentation. This is exactly the kind of innovation our service members need." Friday brought a development that neither Jackson nor I had anticipated: a request for a joint interview from Military Times, the publication that every service member and military family reads. They wanted to feature us as an example of military spouses supporting each other's careers, highlighting how deployment challenges could strengthen rather than strain military marriages. "It's perfect timing," Jackson said as we discussed the interview request. "Mom's campaign to paint you as a gold-digging parasite is about to collide with national media coverage of your professional achievements. The contrast is going to be stark." That evening, as we prepared for what would be a weekend of media interviews and professional calls, Jackson's phone buzzed with yet another message from Constance. He glanced at it, then showed it to me. "Jackson, I've been trying to reach you for days. This silence is childish and hurtful. We need to discuss this situation like adults. I'm your mother, and I deserve more respect than you're showing me. Call me immediately." Jackson deleted the message without responding, then looked at me with something that might have been amusement. "You know what's interesting about timing, Tush? Mom spent months trying to convince everyone that you weren't good enough for this family. And next week, you're going to be featured in national military publications as an example of what military spouses can achieve. She's about to discover what happens when you attack someone who's operating at levels you're too small to even recognize." The external validation wasn't just proving that Constance had been wrong about me. It was demonstrating exactly how catastrophically wrong she'd been. While she'd been busy playing psychological games with a pregnant woman, that woman had been quietly building programs that would influence military mental health care for generations. The irony was so complete it was almost poetic. Constance had demanded respect while systematically disrespecting someone who was already earning the respect of generals, federal officials, and military families across the country. Her timing couldn't have been worse if she'd planned it deliberately. And the external validation was just getting started. The final test of Jackson's resolve came Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after his ultimatum, when Constance decided to deploy what she clearly believed would be her nuclear option. We were preparing for the Military Times interview, scheduled for Monday, when the doorbell rang at 8:47 a.m. Jackson looked through the peephole and his jaw tightened in a way that told me everything I needed to know. "She brought reinforcements," he said grimly. Through the window, I could see not just Constance, but Admiral retired Charles Hartwell, Jackson's father, who I'd met exactly twice in 2 years of marriage. Behind them stood Jackson's uncle Michael, a Marine colonel, and his Aunt Patricia, the family matriarch who usually emerged only for major holidays and family crises. "She's called in the entire command structure," Jackson observed, his military training kicking in as he assessed the tactical situation. "This is her version of bringing overwhelming force to bear on a stubborn subordinate." But something had fundamentally changed in Jackson during his week home. The man who answered the door wasn't the dutiful son who'd spent 30 years deferring to family hierarchy. This was Staff Sergeant Jackson Hartwell, a decorated Army Ranger who'd learned the difference between legitimate authority and manipulative power. "Family meeting," Admiral Hartwell announced without preamble, his command voice designed to cut through any resistance. "Living room, now." "No, sir," Jackson replied calmly, not moving from the doorway. "This is my home, and unannounced visits aren't welcome. If you'd like to schedule a conversation, you can call ahead like anyone else." The shock on his father's face was immediate and complete. In 30 years, Jackson had never directly refused a family order. Uncle Michael stepped forward, clearly prepared to provide additional command presence. "Son, we're here because your mother is concerned about your marriage and the decisions you're making. We need to discuss this situation as a family. We need to discuss my wife being psychologically abused while I was deployed?" Jackson asked, his voice carrying the kind of cold precision that made hardened soldiers pay attention. "We need to discuss how my mother spent months systematically destroying a pregnant woman's mental health? That situation?" Aunt Patricia, who'd clearly been briefed to provide the maternal authority that Constance had lost credibility to wield, stepped into the conversation with the tone she'd probably used to manage family conflicts for decades. "Jackson, honey, you're obviously upset, but you're only hearing one side of this story. Your mother was trying to help Natasha adjust to military life, and sometimes guidance can be misinterpreted by people who aren't used to our family standards." I watched Jackson's expression shift into something I'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but the kind of crystalline clarity that comes when someone finally sees a situation with perfect focus. "Aunt Patricia, with all due respect, I've spent the last week conducting what the military calls a thorough after-action review. I've interviewed witnesses, reviewed documented evidence, and analyzed communication patterns. What my mother did wasn't guidance that was misinterpreted. It was systematic psychological warfare against a pregnant woman." He pulled out his phone and began reading from his notes with the kind of methodical precision he'd use for a mission briefing. Week 1, Mother establishes surveillance protocols under the guise of family dinner. Week 2, Mother begins intelligence gathering about perceived vulnerabilities. Week 3, Mother initiates social isolation by discouraging participation in military spouse networks. Weeks 4 through 7, Mother escalates psychological pressure through systematic criticism and documentation of perceived failures. Week 8, Mother executes full psychological assault, including direct verbal abuse and threats to sabotage marriage. The military terminology he was using wasn't accidental. Jackson was describing his mother's behavior using the same framework he'd used to analyze enemy tactics, and the comparison was impossible to miss. Constance, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, finally found her voice. "Jackson, this is ridiculous. I was trying to help her understand what it means to be part of this family. She's from a completely different background, and she needed guidance to..." "To what?" Jackson interrupted, his voice cutting through her explanation like a blade. "To understand that she wasn't good enough? To accept that her education, her career, her professional achievements meant nothing because they didn't meet your standards? To tolerate being called a parasite while carrying your grandchild?" Admiral Hartwell stepped forward, clearly intending to reassert command authority over what he probably saw as an insubordinate son challenging family hierarchy. "Jackson, you will not speak to your mother that way. We've raised you better than. You raised me to protect people who can't protect themselves," Jackson said, his voice gaining strength. "You raised me to recognize psychological warfare and respond appropriately. You raised me to understand that rank and authority only deserve respect when they're used to protect rather than harm." He gestured toward me, and his voice took on the kind of conviction that comes from absolute moral certainty. "This woman has developed programs that are saving military lives across the United States. She's receiving federal funding to expand mental health care for veterans nationwide. She's being recognized by Pentagon leadership for innovations that could revolutionize how we treat PTSD. And while she was accomplishing all of that, my mother was trying to convince her she was worthless trash." Uncle Michael, who'd been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Jackson, you're obviously emotional about this, but you need to consider the bigger picture. Family unity is more important than individual conflicts. Your mother made mistakes, but family forgives family." Jackson's response was immediate and devastating. "Colonel, with all due respect, sir, family doesn't psychologically torture pregnant women. And military families especially don't engage in behavior that would be considered abuse under the Uniform Code of Military Justice if it happened between service members." The silence that followed was absolute. Jackson had just accused his mother of conduct that would be prosecutable under military law, and he'd done it in front of 3 retired military officers who understood exactly what that meant. Constance's composure finally cracked completely. I gave you life, Jackson. I raised you, sacrificed for you, supported your military career. I deserve better than this disrespect from my own son. You deserve exactly what you've earned, Jackson replied, his voice steady and final. And what you've earned is supervised contact with my family. If you're willing to acknowledge what you did and commit to changed behavior. If you're not willing to do that, then you've earned nothing. Admiral Hartwell made one final attempt to reassert traditional family authority. Son, you're making a mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your life. Family is forever. Wives can be replaced. The words hung in the air like a detonated grenade. Jackson stepped completely outside onto the porch, closing the door behind him so I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see through the window as he moved close enough to his father to speak in tones that wouldn't carry to the neighbors. Whatever Jackson said during that 2-minute conversation, it transformed his father's expression from authoritative confidence to something approaching shock. When Jackson stepped back, Admiral Hartwell was looking at his son like he was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The family delegation left without another word, but Constance paused at the car to deliver one final message that she clearly intended for me to hear through the window. This isn't over, Jackson. You can't cut your family out of your life forever. When this infatuation wears off and you remember what really matters, we'll still be here. But don't expect us to welcome back someone who chose an outsider over his own blood. Jackson watched them drive away, then came back inside and sat heavily on the couch. Well, that's done. What did you say to your father? I told him that if he ever suggested my wife was replaceable again, he'd discover exactly how replaceable fathers can be when they fail to respect their sons' families. Jackson's voice was calm, but his hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline. And I told him that if he wanted to maintain any relationship with his grandchild, he'd better start treating the child's mother with the respect she's earned. I sat beside him, processing what had just happened. Jackson, you just chose me over your entire family. No, Tash, I chose right over wrong. I chose protecting the innocent over enabling the guilty. I chose the family we're building over the family that tried to destroy it. He pulled me against him, his voice growing softer. And I chose the woman who's changing how the military treats veterans over the people who couldn't see her value because they were too busy protecting their own power. The test was over. Jackson had faced the full weight of family pressure, military hierarchy, and generational authority, and he'd held his position without wavering. Constance's nuclear option had failed completely, and in the process, she'd managed to alienate not just Jackson, but potentially the entire family structure she'd been trying to preserve. What happens now? Now we go to our interview tomorrow, and we tell the story of a military couple who prioritized integrity over tradition, Jackson said. And we let the world decide who deserves respect in this family. The Military Times interview took place Monday morning in our living room, with photographer and journalist Sarah Martinez setting up equipment while Jackson and I prepared to tell our story to the publication that reached every military family in America. What we didn't expect was how quickly the interview would shift from a feature about military spouse success to something much more significant. Mrs. Hartwell, Sarah began, we understand you've developed an innovative therapy program while your husband was deployed. Can you tell us about balancing professional development with the challenges of military family life? I started with the standard talking points about the animal therapy program, the federal funding, the expansion plans. But Sarah was an experienced military journalist, and she picked up on undercurrents that we hadn't planned to discuss. It sounds like you accomplished all of this without much family support system. That must have been challenging during your husband's deployment. Jackson and I exchanged glances. We'd agreed to keep the focus on professional achievements, but the question opened a door that we hadn't fully anticipated walking through. Military families face unique challenges, I said carefully. Not everyone understands unconventional career paths or the demands of developing new programs. Can you elaborate on that? Jackson leaned forward, and I recognized the expression that meant he'd made a tactical decision. Sarah, what my wife isn't saying is that she accomplished everything you're writing about, while being systematically undermined by family members who couldn't recognize her value. The room went quiet except for the soft click of the photographer's camera. Sarah set down her notes and looked directly at Jackson. Sergeant Hartwell, are you saying your wife faced opposition from military family members while you were deployed? I'm saying that some people in military families confuse tradition with toxicity, Jackson replied, his voice carrying the kind of measured authority that made it clear this wasn't an emotional outburst but a calculated statement. My wife revolutionized veteran mental health care while being told she wasn't good enough to belong in a military family. That contrast speaks to something larger about how we define value and contribution in military communities. The interview shifted completely at that point. Sarah Martinez wasn't just writing a success story anymore. She was documenting something that resonated with military families across all branches of service. The tension between traditional military hierarchy and modern military spouse achievement. The challenge of supporting unconventional career paths within conventional military structures. Mrs. Hartwell, how did you maintain focus on your professional goals while dealing with family opposition? I had to learn that my value wasn't determined by people who couldn't see it, I said, finding my voice in a way that surprised me. The veterans I work with, the colleagues who support my research, the federal officials who funded my programs, they could see what I was building. I had to stop seeking validation from people who were more invested in maintaining their own power than recognizing genuine contribution. Jackson nodded, then added something that would end up being quoted in military publications for months afterward. In the Army, we're trained to identify genuine threats versus manufactured conflicts. Sometimes the biggest threat to military families isn't external. It's internal resistance to growth and change. The interview lasted 3 hours. By the end, Sarah had enough material for what would become a cover story about military families navigating generational change, traditional expectations versus modern achievement, and the importance of choosing loyalty to principles over loyalty to dysfunction. This is going to be bigger than a spouse success story, Sarah told us as she packed up her equipment. This touches on issues that every military family deals with. The question of who gets to define what military spouses should be, what careers they should pursue, how much they should accommodate family expectations that might be holding them back. Tuesday brought a development that none of us saw coming. The article hadn't even been published yet, but word had spread through military journalism networks that Military Times was running a significant piece about military family dynamics and spouse achievement. Before noon, I received calls from 3 other military publications wanting to follow up with their own stories. More significantly, General Sarah Chen's office called to move up our Pentagon meeting. The general has been following recent developments in military spouse advocacy, her aide explained. She believes your story represents broader issues that need attention at policy levels. The Pentagon meeting, originally scheduled for the following month, was moved to Thursday, 2 days away. And it wasn't just going to be about my animal therapy programs anymore. It was going to be about military family support structures and how traditional military hierarchies sometimes failed to support military spouse achievement. Wednesday brought the publication of the Military Times article, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The cover featured a photo of Jackson and me at the Animal Rescue Center, with the headline, "Breaking Barriers: When Military Tradition Clashes with Military Spouse Innovation." The article was comprehensive, covering my professional achievements while also addressing the broader theme of generational conflict within military families. Sarah had done something remarkable. She'd written about our specific situation in a way that made it universally relevant to military communities dealing with similar tensions. Within hours, my phone was ringing constantly, military spouses from across the country calling to share similar stories. Reporters from civilian publications wanting to explore the military family dynamics the article had highlighted. Officials from veteran organizations asking about speaking engagements and program expansions. But the most significant call came Wednesday evening, from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Hensley from the Veterinary College, calling with news that would change everything about how this story ended. Natasha, I've just gotten off the phone with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The Military Times article has apparently made its way to cabinet-level discussions about military family support policies. They want to use your program as a model for a new initiative to support military spouse professional development nationwide. A cabinet-level initiative, based on my work, addressing the exact issues that Constance had tried to use to destroy my marriage. There's more, Dr. Hensley continued. The Secretary wants to announce this initiative at a press conference next week, and they want you to be the featured speaker. This would put your work in front of national media, policymakers, and military leadership at the highest levels. Jackson, who'd been listening on speakerphone, sat back with an expression of amazed disbelief. Tash, they want you to speak at a cabinet-level press conference about military spouse achievement. Thursday's Pentagon meeting exceeded every expectation we'd had. General Chen had assembled a room full of senior military leaders, policy experts, and veteran affairs officials to hear about expanding my animal therapy programs. But the conversation quickly evolved into something much larger. Mrs. Hartwell, General Chen said during the meeting, your professional success story has highlighted systemic issues in how military families support spouse career development. We're seeing this as an opportunity to address those issues at policy levels. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end, we discussed not just animal therapy programs, but comprehensive military family support initiatives, spouse career development policies, and family conflict resolution resources. My personal experience with Constance's psychological warfare had become a case study in how military families could better support unconventional achievement. As we left the Pentagon, Jackson was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You know what's remarkable about this, Tash? Mom spent months trying to prove you weren't good enough for our family, and instead, she created a situation that's going to help thousands of military families nationwide. How do you figure? If she hadn't pushed you to the breaking point, we never would have addressed these issues publicly. The Military Times article, the Pentagon meeting, the Cabinet initiative. None of that happens if she'd just been decent to you from the beginning." That evening, we sat in our living room reviewing everything that had happened in 2 weeks. From Jackson's surprise return to the Pentagon meetings to the upcoming cabinet press conference, Constance's campaign to destroy our marriage had instead catapulted us into national military leadership circles. "There's something I need to tell you," Jackson said, pulling out his phone. "I've been documenting everything for the past 2 weeks. Every voicemail, every text, every attempt at contact. Not because I'm planning to use it against her, but because I wanted a complete record of how someone responds when they lose control over a situation they'd been manipulating." He showed me his phone. 83 missed calls from Constance since his ultimatum. 47 text messages ranging from pleading to angry to threatening. Multiple attempts to contact him through other family members, his commanding officer, even the Veterinary College. "She's not accepting the new reality," he observed. "But that's not our problem anymore. Our problem is preparing for a press conference where you're going to represent military spouse achievement to the entire country." The ultimate resolution wasn't just about our family conflict anymore. It had become about something much larger, about how military families could evolve, how tradition could support rather than suppress achievement, and how individual courage could create systemic change. Constance had lost more than access to her son's family. She'd lost relevance to a conversation that was now happening at levels she could never reach, about issues she'd helped create but could never solve. 6 months later, I stood in the rose garden of the White House, 8 months pregnant and glowing in the April sunshine, watching President Hayes sign the Military Family Support Enhancement Act into law. The legislation, which had grown directly from the initiative sparked by our story, would provide comprehensive career development support for military spouses nationwide and establish new protocols for family conflict resolution within military communities. Jackson stood beside me in his dress blues, promoted to Sergeant First Class just 3 weeks earlier. His commanding officer had specifically cited his, quote, exceptional leadership in addressing family welfare issues that impact military readiness in the promotion recommendation. The same family crisis that Constance had created to destroy our marriage had ended up advancing Jackson's military career in ways that traditional deployment success might never have achieved. As I watched the president hand me the signing pen, a tradition for civilians whose advocacy had contributed to significant legislation, I couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought us to this moment. From that devastating Sunday afternoon in Constance's kitchen, to standing in the nation's most powerful space, being recognized for work that was already improving lives across military communities nationwide. The animal therapy program now operated at 47 military installations across the United States, with plans to expand to overseas bases within the year. The federal funding had grown to $8.2 million annually, supporting not just the therapy programs but also research initiatives, training protocols, and family support services that had grown from the original concept. More importantly, the Military Family Support Enhancement Act included provisions that would have protected me from exactly the kind of psychological warfare Constance had waged. New resources for military spouses dealing with family conflict, expanded career development support, and protocols for addressing abuse within military family structures, protections that would benefit thousands of military families for generations to come. Dr. Patricia Hensley, who'd flown in from Colorado for the signing ceremony, found us after the formal presentations ended. Natasha, do you realize what you've accomplished here? 6 months ago, you were being psychologically terrorized by your mother-in-law. Today, you're standing in the Rose Garden because your response to that terrorism has changed military family policy for the entire country. The transformation still felt surreal sometimes. The woman who'd been called a parasite was now being introduced at military events as, quote, Dr. Natasha Pierce Hartwell, Presidential Advisor on Military Family Wellness. The doctorate had come as an honorary degree from Colorado State University, recognizing my contributions to veterinary medicine and military mental health. The advisory position had evolved from the cabinet-level initiative, making me one of the youngest civilians ever to hold a formal advisory role with the Department of Defense. But the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source 2 months earlier. Colonel Martinez at Fort Carson had called to tell me about a letter that had arrived at her office. Mrs. Hartwell, I received correspondence from Admiral Retired Charles Hartwell. He wanted me to know that he'd been following your work, and that he regretted not recognizing your contributions to military families earlier. He asked me to convey his respect for what you've accomplished. Jackson's father had never contacted us directly, but the message through military channels was significant in its own way. It was an acknowledgement, delivered through proper military protocol, that he'd been wrong about my value to the military community. Not a personal apology, but a professional recognition that carried its own weight in military circles. Jackson's uncle Michael had gone further, writing a letter directly to Jackson that arrived the week before the White House ceremony. Son, it read, I've been watching your wife's achievements from a distance, and I need to acknowledge that I failed to recognize what she was building while we were busy protecting what we thought we already had. She's brought more honor to the Hartwell name than any of us have in decades. I hope someday we can earn the right to be part of what you're building together. The one person who hadn't acknowledged the new reality was, predictably, Constance. The calls and texts had finally stopped after Jackson changed his phone number in February, but through family networks we heard she was still telling anyone who would listen that my success was somehow artificial, temporary, or undeserved. She'd apparently convinced herself that the national recognition was part of some elaborate conspiracy to make her look bad. She can't accept that she was wrong, Jackson had observed during one of our evening walks with Rex through the Virginia suburbs where we'd moved after I'd accepted the advisory position. Accepting that would mean acknowledging that she spent months torturing someone who was already operating at levels she could never imagine. It's easier for her to believe in elaborate conspiracies than to face the simple truth that she completely misjudged the situation. The new house reflected how completely our lives had changed. Instead of the small apartment in Fort Collins, we now had a home with a dedicated office where I could conduct video conferences with military installations worldwide, a nursery that Jackson had painted, with murals depicting rescue animals and military families, and a large backyard where Rex could run while we planned the expansion of programs that were touching thousands of lives. More importantly, the house was filled with the kind of family we'd chosen to build: military couples from our support network who stopped by for dinner, veterans from the therapy programs who'd become friends, colleagues from the veterinary and military mental health communities who'd become our chosen family, people who celebrated our achievements without needing to diminish them, who supported our unconventional path without trying to redirect it toward their own expectations. The baby was due in 3 weeks, and we'd already received more offers of support than we could possibly accept. Military spouses from across the country wanting to send gifts. Veteran organizations offering to provide childcare so I could continue traveling for program implementations. Colleagues eager to ensure that becoming a mother wouldn't slow down work that was too important to pause. "You know what I've learned from all this?" I said to Jackson as we sat on our back porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the Virginia sky in shades of amber and rose. Family isn't about blood or tradition or meeting other people's expectations. It's about building something together that makes everyone stronger. What do you mean? Look at what we've created: a therapy program that's saving military lives, legislation that's protecting military families, a marriage that's stronger because we chose each other over dysfunction, a career that's making a difference at national levels. None of that would have existed if we just accepted Constance's version of what our family should look like. Jackson pulled me closer, his hand resting on my belly where our daughter was moving restlessly, as if she was eager to join the world we'd built for her. She's going to grow up knowing that family means choosing people who celebrate who you are, not people who demand you become someone else. The evening was peaceful in a way that would have been impossible 9 months earlier. No anxiety about family phone calls. No walking on eggshells around people who claim to love us while systematically undermining our happiness. No energy wasted on managing other people's dysfunction or proving our worth to people who'd chosen not to see it. "Do you ever miss them?" I asked. "Your original family, I mean, before all this happened." Jackson was quiet for a long time, watching Rex chase fireflies in the yard. "I miss the idea of them," he said finally. "I miss believing that they were people worth the loyalty I gave them. But I don't miss the reality of who they actually were. And I definitely don't miss the version of myself that I had to be to keep them comfortable." "What version was that?" "Smaller," he said simply. "I had to stay smaller than my potential, so they could feel bigger than their limitations. But you never asked me to be smaller, Tash. You celebrated when I got promoted, supported when I wanted to take on leadership roles, encouraged me to think beyond what I thought I could achieve. That's the difference between family that constrains and family that liberates." As the stars began appearing in the darkening sky, we talked about the future we were building, the therapy programs that would expand internationally, the research initiatives that would influence trauma treatment across all populations, not just military families, the daughter who would grow up knowing that her parents had chosen love over loyalty, integrity over tradition, growth over comfort. "Sometimes I think Constance did us a favor," I said, feeling the baby kick in response to the sound of my voice. "Not intentionally, obviously, but by forcing us to choose between her dysfunction and our own values. She made us stronger than we ever would have been if we'd just tried to keep the peace." "How do you figure?" "If she'd been moderately awful instead of completely terrible, we might have spent years trying to manage her behavior instead of establishing the boundaries that actually protect our family. If she'd been subtle instead of vicious, we might never have developed the clarity we needed to build something better." Jackson nodded, understanding what I meant. Extreme situations require extreme clarity. She forced us to decide who we really were and what we really valued. And it turns out we valued integrity over comfort, truth over tradition, and our own family over the approval of people who couldn't see our worth. The woman who'd called me a parasite had inadvertently given us the greatest gift possible, the complete freedom to become who we were meant to be, without any obligation to make ourselves smaller for people who couldn't handle our growth. And as we sat there in the gathering darkness, planning the future we'd build for our daughter, I realized that sometimes the best revenge is simply living so well that your former tormentors become irrelevant to your story. Constance Hartwell had demanded respect while showing none. Now she would spend the rest of her life watching from a distance as the woman she'd called worthless changed military families across the entire country. That seemed like justice enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.